Cantor Ellerin is not the only composer leading us in prayer this year. The man in your program indicating the composer of that last melody was our cantorial intern, Becky Mann. She'll sign your supplement afterwards if you want. Beautiful, Becky, thank you. Gives me a nice segue, actually, because Becky spent this last year studying her first year of cantorial school at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. And so she was there in April during the first Israeli election this year. I gather you didn't get to vote, probably. One who has become our own, Max Buchdahl, is there during this week's election, and his father told me that Max may have just figured out a way to vote, actually, in the elections, possibly. We will all get to vote, as you'll see in a flyer in the hallway, on the World Zionist elections come the beginning of 2020, a whole different subject for a different day. Instead, let me pick up where I left off last week. Last week I explained the system, since it was a family Shabbat to a group probably less familiar with how Israeli elections work than we who have lived through more may be. But this was a first-time event. This was the first time that Israel had to hold two elections in 1 year. The first time that a coalition wasn't able to be formed in the aftermath, even if it took weeks or months of an election. And the scariest thing being mentioned in Israel since the election earlier this week is the possibility of a third election. The Israeli, I say that not as a joke, the Israeli President Rivlin, who was not elected in this election, has said he will do everything he can to get the parties to a coalition and to avoid that third vote. So tonight, unlike last week, is not a primer, but let me remind you, Israel has one house in its legislature, the Knesset, 120 seats. You run as a whole list. You don't have a geographical place, and you run on a list that has been presented of your party before the election, or your parties, because actually a large number of the lists that won in this election are not merely one party, but a myriad of parties in some cases, and it takes a list 3.25% to get into the Knesset. You can ask someone else about the math later. Therefore, it takes 61 seats to form a governing coalition in a country that doesn't really have a division between the legislative and the executive branches. So, instead of a primer, and instead of the ability to give deep analysis on an election that just happened and hasn't yet produced a coalition, and having spent the last few days trying to read up on people across the spectrum in the world smarter than me on this, I realize what we realize in the aftermath of any election just about anywhere. Even though the stakes are incredibly high, this is fascinating and entertaining. But because the stakes are so high, we don't yet really fully understand what has occurred. So some initial thoughts. Rabbi Josh Weinberg, who is both an Israeli and an American citizen, and the executive director of ARTSA, our Reform Movement's Zionist branch, wrote in a blog this week. Some are touting that the real winner here is Israeli democracy, as the system appears to work, and Israelis showed up and voted in high numbers. That I've read everywhere. It's what Josh says next that I choose to share. I don't buy it, he writes, and not because I don't like democracy. Lauding Israel's democracy as the winner actually acknowledges that there could be a plausible alternative. This is akin to stepping on the scale to weigh yourself. And if you're not terribly pleased with the results, you step back to say, gosh, I really should celebrate that scale for working and doing its job. No, we should see democracy as a foundation, and while celebrating it is nice, we shouldn't take it for granted democracy is neither a winner or loser in these elections. It is the base upon which Israel is formed. And so, some thoughts of what happened within that democracy. Thankfully, Otzma Yehudit, the party called Jewish Power, did not meet the threshold. It got below 2% of the votes. I say that comfortably in that Otzma Yehudit is actually the successor party to the banned Kach party of the late Rabbi Meir Kahane. Due to the fact that it's a different party, it was allowed to run, though a few of its original names on its list were barred by the committee that in Israel decides who can run and not run. And they don't bar people often. In fact, I think they've only barred them for the racism held within this party. Thankfully, Bibi Netanyahu's Likud and Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party are both jockeying to see if they can reach the 61 seats needed to form a coalition without each other or with each other or with some modified version of each other. I say thankfully in that there are two robust parties, each within their own complications, trying to lead the way here. Realistically, maybe problematically from my viewpoint, the three Orthodox parties, Shas, United Torah Judaism, and Yamina, which actually includes the remains of the National Religious Party, even if it's not fully Orthodox, still hold fully a fifth of the seats in the Knesset, still hold real power. Though Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu maintains a strongly anti-religious swing vote. And if you haven't heard of him before, you've been reading about him this week. Interestingly, as many commentators have noted, Amin Odeh and the primarily Arab Joint List are talking this time in the election campaign and this week about being part of the process, not just being a voice against Israel, and not just being a voice, as they wouldn't say themselves, but repeating the Palestinian Authority position. The Arabs this time wanted an active role within the discussion. There was a 69% voting turnout in Israel as a whole. 60% of the Arabs or Druze voted in this election, in that case a small increase from April's election. And 17% of the Arabs or Druze voted for Jewish majority parties, not just the Arab list. It's interesting to watch how this plays out. The results and the comments since then have been complicated, but as I've often said, the mere presence of the Arab list, of the joint list, and the reality of how many non-Jews voted in Israel, and the possibility, depending on what coalition gets formed, that the head of the joint list, a non-Jew, may actually be the head of the opposition in the Knesset for the first time. All of that shows that Israel is not an apartheid state. Don't believe what you see on signs. Don't believe what you see in comments on articles you may read on the internet. The third largest party in the Knesset is this joint list. The Arab vote had a huge impact on the election and its results. Are there issues? Sure. Apartheid? I don't buy it. Now, you may feel more confused about Israel than ever after my brief comments. And if you want to feel even more confused, I encourage you to follow online. Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel, Haaretz, numerous other sources. Don't take it fed through an American organization. Read and follow it on your own. And I assure you, over the next weeks likely of negotiations, you'll be more confused than ever. But hopefully in the process, you'll also know more than ever and feel more connected to Israel, its vibrancy, its debate, its confusion, and possibilities. May the leaders of Israel find their way to a solid and stable governing coalition. May they avoid a third election. with similar results. And may those who are divided by their votes find unity of purpose in their governing. Amen. We turn to page